In this lesson, we're going to begin looking at operations with fractions, and we're just going to focus on multiplication and division with fractions. And unlike regular operations with whole numbers, addition and subtraction usually come first. But with fractions, it's actually easier to multiply and divide fractions. So we're going to focus on that in this lesson. And then in the next lesson, we'll look at adding and subtracting fractions. So the first question is, why do you need to know how to do operations with fractions? So if we consider this example with a recipe, recipes typically have fractions multiple times being used. So what happens if you have this recipe and you only want to make a half of the amount, or you want to make a third of the amount? This is where fractions are going to come into play. So if a recipe calls for 3/4 of a cup of flour, but we only want to make half of the recipe, that means we only want half of 3/4 cup of flour. So how much flour do we actually use? So I want to take a half of 3/4 of a cup. So the operation, whenever you see the word of, it's typically going to mean multiplication. So it's going to be 1/2 times 3/4 is what we're going to be doing here. And whenever you go and multiply fractions, what you're going to do is you're just going to multiply the numbers across the top. So basically, multiply 1 times 3, we get 3. And then multiply the numbers across the bottom. 2 times 4 gives me 8. And then if you can reduce, you want to go ahead and reduce it. But when I look at 3 and 8, these don't share any common factors. So the answer is I'm going to need 3/8 of a cup of flour. So then let's just look at some other examples with multiplication. So first thing I want to do is write down the rule that we just basically talked about. So the rule for multiplication of fractions is basically you multiply the numerators and then you multiply the denominators. So I'm going to multiply across the top, which are the numerators, and then that is going to go over the product of the denominators, so that you multiply the denominators. And then, of course, simplify if possible. And if you had like multiple fractions that you're multiplying, you follow the same rule. Multiply all the numerators and then divide that by the product of all of the denominators. And then you just simplify when you're all done. So let's just look at some more examples of multiplying. So go ahead and just write these examples in. So for the first one here, we're going to have 3/5 times 2/7. So when we go ahead to multiply these, multiply across the top. So 3 times 2 is going to give me 6. Multiply across the bottom, we get 35. And in this case, we can't simplify, so we're just going to leave it as is. So let's look at just a couple more. So a second example here, if we have 3/8 times 5. So now we have a fraction times a whole number. If you remember, any whole number can always be put over 1, because 5 divided by 1 is still going to be 5. So that's why we put it over 1. And then in terms of actually going through and multiplying, we follow the same process. Multiply the numerators. So 3 times 5 gives me 15. Multiply the denominators, we get 8. And again, this doesn't simplify, so we just leave it as is. And then one last example. So in this one we have 3 fractions. 1/2 times 3/4 times 1/5. So just like I mentioned before, multiply all the numerators. So 1 times 3 times 1. 1 times 3 is 3. 3 times 1 is still going to give me 3. And then across the bottom, so we have 2 times 4 gives me 8. 8 times 5 is going to give me 40. So same process, it's just now you have a third number to deal with when you're multiplying the top and then multiplying the denominators. So then the next thing I want to look at is, how do we divide fractions? So the rule for dividing fractions is actually very similar to multiplying. The difference is instead of just multiplying, what you need to do is you need to multiply by what's called the reciprocal. So the rule for dividing is you're just going to multiply by the reciprocal. So in order to be able to divide, you have to know how to multiply because it's basically going to be the same thing, but before we can actually multiply it, we have to change whatever we're dividing by, we have to change it into its reciprocal. So basically what this really means, you've probably heard the saying, keep, change, flip is the saying. So basically that means we're going to keep the first one, we're going to change the sign of multiplication, but we're going to flip the second fraction. So flipping is really the reciprocal. So this reciprocal means we're flipping the fraction. So let's look at some examples. So for the first one here, we have 3/8 and we're going to divide that by 9/4. So the saying goes, you keep the first one. So the first one here is going to stay the same. So we're going to keep this. The next part of the saying is change. So the sign is going to change. So instead of division, it's going to become multiplication. And then the last thing is to flip. So that's going to go with this fraction. We're going to flip it. So when I flip 9/4, the reciprocal is going to be 4/9. So now basically what I have is a division problem that became multiplication because dividing by a fraction is really multiplying by its reciprocal. So now I can just go ahead and apply the rules from the last section there where we multiply. So I'm going to multiply the numerators, I get 12. Multiply the denominators, I get 72. And then see if we can reduce. In this case, both the top and bottom are divisible by 12. So I'm going to go ahead and reduce that. So I'm going to get 1/6. And then one last example here. So if I start with 2/3 and I want to divide that by 2, so now I'm taking a fraction and dividing it by a whole number, I'm still going to follow the same rule. So I'm going to keep the first one, so it's going to stay 2/3. So we keep. Then we're going to change the sign to multiplication. And then I'm going to flip the last one. So when I flip this last one, remember anytime you see 2 and you're dealing with fractions, or you see a whole number and you're dealing with fractions, you always want to put it over 1. It's not changing it. 2 divided by 1 is still 2. But we want to think of it as a fraction because our operations and our rules are basically set up for fractions in this particular lesson. So keep the first one, change the sign, flip the second one. So instead of 2/1, it's going to be 1/2. And now we can multiply across the top, so we get 2. Multiply across the bottom, we get 6. And then we reduce it, so we can divide the top and bottom by 2 is the biggest number. And we end up with 1/3. So that's really it for dividing and multiplying. So multiplying, multiply across the top, multiply across the bottom. And then dividing, same idea, you got to turn it into a multiplication problem by, remember the saying, keep, change, flip. So keep the first fraction, change the operation or the sign, and then flip the second fraction to its reciprocal.